All right, we are going to try something here today. This video is not going to be for everyone. This is for total beginners to Blender and doing my best to introduce you to this software, what it's capable of, and how you can get started using it. Now, I've taught a lot of different classes and courses over the years in Blender, and something that I'm reminded of sometimes is there are people that are still coming to this software for the first time ever. And some of the content that I put out there being more for intermediate or advanced users, or really specific into one little niche within Blender, it's not for everyone. So I wanted to just take some time tonight to sit down and to give you a look at this software as someone that's never seen it before. So stick with me and I will get you on your feet. This is a crash course, meaning I'm going to show you as much as I can in a short amount of time as I can, but I expect to be here for a little bit talking to you. So this is Blender. I'm not going to show you how to install it. If you don't know how to install software, this isn't the tutorial for you. Just go to blender.org, and when you open up Blender for the first time, depending on the version that you're on, you'll see something like this. I'm in version 4.3, which at the time of making this is the current released version. There are also experimental builds, and because it's open source, because they're developing it openly for the world to see, you can go download their latest versions that they're working on right now. But 4.3 is what we're working on. And you can tell it's 4.3 just by looking at the top left, or when you open it up for the first time, you'll get this little splash screen and it'll show you the version right there. So this is version 4.3. You're greeted with what we call the 3D viewport. If you've never done 3D software before, it's just this big window right here. And this is basically like an infinite world where we interact with every object that we're working on. In this world, there's what we call a world origin, which is kind of the center of the whole world. So 3D stands for 3 dimensions. And those 3 dimensions are represented by 3 letters, X, Y, and Z. Depending on the 3D software you're using, those letters will represent different directions. But in Blender, X and Y are our horizontal directions, and Z is the vertical. So when we're looking at this cube, and I'll show you how to navigate around in just a minute, you can see these lines, these colored lines. These represent the different axes, whatever the plural of that word is. And as you can see, we have our X is represented in this red line, and our Y is represented with this green. So this, where this cube is right now, is the center of our 3D viewport. It's the center, it's the world origin, because it's where those 2 axes are intersecting. If we could see Z, it would be right in the middle, and just for you, I'll turn it on so you can see right there. Now, this is turned off by default. We'll get into all of these different menus and how to turn off and on settings. We'll get there, one step at a time. Now, you've seen me kind of rotate around. There are, depending on the 3D software you're using, they each handle this a little bit differently. Blender is a little bit different in a lot of ways, and that's because it's been developed kind of unapologetically to be its own tool, and it's not necessarily trying to be like other tools, even if those other tools are wildly popular or considered quote-unquote industry standard. So Blender's way of navigating around your scene is using your mouse. The middle mouse button, if you click that down, you'll be able to do what we call orbit. That's just kind of rotating around a point in space. Now, I recommend, because you'll be using the middle mouse button so much, I personally recommend getting a mouse that has a mappable thumb button. Most modern mice, these days, you can map a thumb button to be whatever you want. I have this mouse. It's kind of a weird one. It's ergonomic, but I have a thumb button right there. So my middle mouse button, I just use my thumb, and that's just more comfortable for me because I'm using middle mouse so much. So hold down middle mouse, click and drag, and you will orbit. Now, if you hold down Shift and middle mouse, you're going to do a pan. So that's just moving back and forth, up and down. And if you hold down Control and middle mouse and move your mouse forwards and backwards, you will zoom in and out. Or you can just use your scroll wheel. So the first time you're trying to get used to moving around in 3D space, it's going to hurt your brain and it's not going to be comfortable. But with any new skill, it takes developing muscle memory. So as you continue to do this, what I always recommend someone that's never navigated around in Blender before is just throw on a movie on your phone or on a different monitor and just hang out for a while and just have fun kind of moving around your scene. And before you know it, it'll start to get really comfortable and you'll be able to have that muscle memory. So you're not thinking about, okay, how do I zoom in? How do I get to this point? It's just second nature. You're working on whatever you're working on and you can just kind of get to where you need to go. That said, there are some settings I like to customize for my own work with my navigation. So for the first time, we're going to get into just some preferences. To get to your preferences, just like lots of other software, you're going to go up to Edit and Preferences, okay? Once we're here, you're going to see a lot of different things, some different tabs over here. What I'm concerned about, because it's what we're talking about, is navigation. So just go ahead and click navigation here. And I'm going to change two settings. Now, the nice thing about Blender is it has really great explanations for all the different settings that you can use across the whole software. All you have to do is hover over it, and it will tell you exactly what that slider or the button or whatever it is you're looking at, it'll tell you exactly what it does. So this says use the depth under the mouse to improve view, pan, rotate, zoom functionality. That's what it does. I'm going to show you the difference on practically what that looks like. So for now, I'm going to turn that on. And the second one is zoom to mouse position. It's kind of self-evident what that does, but let's just read it. Zoom in towards the mouse pointer's position in the 3D view rather than the 2D window center. So by default, what Blender will do when you zoom in is it will just zoom into the center of your 3D viewport. What you could do here is zoom to mouse positions. You could point somewhere off in the distance and zoom in, and it will zoom in with your mouse as the focus. Personally, I like this. Now, after you make some changes, there's going to be a little asterisk next to your save preferences. That's just letting you know, hey, you made some changes and they're not saved. If I were to exit out of this without saving, it's not going to get rid of my changes. All it's saying is if I exited Blender without saving, then those aren't going to be saved. So I saved my preferences, and we can exit our preferences now. And let's just continue moving around here, navigating, and see what changes we've made. I'm going to go grab a drink of water, though, so you don't have to listen to dry mouth. So I'll be back. All right, take a deep breath. You're doing good. There's a lot I'm going to throw at you, and I'm just going to take it one step at a time. But just hang in there. Learning anything new requires you to lean in and put forward some effort to try to retain the knowledge that you're gaining right now. So after we've changed some of our preferences, we can kind of see what the new functionality is. Now remember, one thing that I said was the zoom to mouse position. Instead of zooming to the center of the frame, we could point over in this corner, for example, if our cube was over here, and it's going to zoom towards that cube. Same thing with the, now I've forgotten the name of it. Same thing with depth, is it's going to look at the mouse's position and it's going to rotate around the position. So if I was working over here and I wanted to rotate around this corner, in this far corner, I could just put my mouse there and rotate. You can see how that's different from the near corner right here. If that doesn't make sense, play around, see what you like. I personally like these settings, and yeah, we're gonna roll with them. So we've looked at navigation. You're gonna have to build some muscle memory. Now let's look at a few other things. So to select an object in Blender, you can just left click. We have a few objects here, and we'll go over what each of these are in just a minute. But you can left click to select anything. If you just click out in empty space, that will deselect whatever you had selected. We're also going to go over some keyboard shortcuts as we go. Blender is very heavy on the keyboard shortcuts. So I'm going to try to show you how to access things in the menus, as well as how to access things with shortcuts. Some things are just shortcuts, so you're going to have to get used to pressing the specific keys that you need. A lot of people have a problem with that with Blender. A lot of people say there's too many shortcuts, but that is actually kind of a remnant of what Blender has been in the past. Personally, I've used Blender for 15, 16 years now, and it's come a long way. It's put a lot of things in the menus that used to be just shortcuts, but some of that lives on, and some of that lives on within me. As I teach people, I'm used to using shortcuts because I think it's fast, because I know where the shortcuts are, so I tend to teach people shortcuts. Anyway, one of the shortcuts we're going to look at right now, as we're talking about selecting, is A on the keyboard. And that, usually with a shortcut, I remember a word that's associated with it. So A is for all. That's just select all. You can also hit Alt-A, and that will deselect all. You can also just click on an empty space. Sometimes when you're working, you don't have an empty space. If I was like working inside of this cube, for example, I don't have an empty space to click in. So Alt-A is how to deselect everything. There are also a few other ways we could do that, which we should look at right now. On our left-hand side here, we have a column of tools. Now, a lot of things in Blender are what we call context sensitive. So things will change depending on what you have selected. Right now, we just have our basic tools, and on the very top here, we have a selection box. Now this is similar to a lot of different programs. One that comes to mind, like Photoshop, if it has this little arrow on the bottom right, that means if you click on it and hold down your left mouse button, you'll get some additional options here. So we have selection box, we have selection circle, which is kind of this little paintbrush where you can draw over and select things. We also have select lasso, which is more of kind of a curvy tool. You can draw whatever shape you want to select things. But I typically just keep this at select box, and then you could just click and drag and select whatever you want. You can also, like a lot of different software, just hold down Shift and select multiple items at once. Now you might have seen this already, but as I've been selecting things in the 3D viewport, things are happening over here in this little table as well, this spreadsheet looking area. And what this is up here is called our outliner. So this is just a way to keep organized and to find things we're looking for. Because sometimes, like I said, you might be working inside of a cube, for example, and I'll show you how to do that little navigation trick I did in just a second. But how would we select the light if we're sitting in here? We can't see anything. Well, that's where the outliner comes in handy. We can keep things organized. We can put things into different folders called collections, which I'll get into. So just know that what you're doing in the 3D viewport is mirrored or mimicked over here in the outliner. So I could also just click and drag and select all three of these objects here. Click, hold down Shift, select objects, hold down Control to deselect objects. Now something interesting happened when I shift selected all three objects, and just pay attention to the colors here. With our default user interface color palette, we have something that's happening. When we select an object, it's outlined in this yellow. But if I shift select a second object, you'll notice that first one turned to a darker orange. And if again I shift select this third object, now both the cube and it's a camera over here, they're both dark orange, and then this circle over here, which is a light, is that light orange. If I keep holding down Shift and go back and forth between these, you'll notice that they trade off being the yellow object and the other ones remain orange. If I deselect everything, the highlight goes away. It just becomes normal black lines. What this is telling us is Blender has two different states for something being selected. You can see it in the outliner here too. The text is either this dark orange or the light yellow. The two different states are selected and active. The difference is you can have many objects selected in Blender, but you can only have one active object at a time. And the reason for this will become evident as we go deeper and start looking at different tools and different things you could do in Blender. But just keep that in mind, that only one object is active and the other ones, even if you have many selected at once. All right, hang in there. We've gone over navigation, we've gone over selecting and deselecting. Now let's just look at deleting objects. So let's select our cube, and there's a few things you can do to delete it. One thing, like you probably guessed, is you can hit delete on your keyboard and that will delete it. Another thing you can do is hit X on your keyboard. And you might ask, why would it be X? That's such a weird key. Well, it has less to do with what the key is, and it has more to do with the key's position on your keyboard. When we're working in 3D, the more time we can spend looking at our monitor and less time we spend looking at our keyboard, the better. So a lot of shortcuts tend to be focused around where your off mouse hand is just sitting on your keyboard. For me, I'm right-handed. My left hand is sitting on this bottom left corner of my keyboard where the X key is. And so that's just really close. I can just quickly hit the X key and my hand is already kind of resting there. My pinky is on the Control key, my ring finger is on the Shift key, and then my index finger is just hanging out on X. So that's why delete is also the X key, just because that's a function you're going to be doing all the time. It's kind of like Control Z to undo. The reason it's right there is because you typically don't have to look down at your keyboard to perform that function. So if you press X, you'll notice you get this annoying pop-up. I don't like this pop-up. If I've decided to delete something, I don't want a little pop-up that says, are you sure you want to delete it? I typically just want to delete it. So that's another thing we're going to change in our preferences. Just go to Edit and Preferences, and this time we're going to be looking at the key map because this has to do with our shortcut. And we can search the key map by name, so I'm just going to search for delete. And we have a lot of different X keys that have delete functions. And the reason for this, like I mentioned before, Blender is context sensitive. So it matters where your mouse is and where you're working when you press a particular key. For this case, we're looking for just object mode, which is something we'll get into. But just go down to where it says object mode, where it says X and delete. Let's drop this down, and where it says confirm, I'm just going to turn that off because I don't want to confirm when I delete something. I just want it to delete and be gone. So I press X, I didn't have to confirm it, and it's gone. If you made a mistake, you can just hit Control Z. If you want to, that's just your undo. If you want to redo after you've backed up, you can hit Control Shift Z. And again, those are there just because it's easy for your left hand to kind of hang out and perform those keyboard shortcuts. Now, I said one more thing earlier in the preferences, but I want to show you another thing we're going to change. So go back to Edit and Preferences. Speaking of undos, Blender, because it's trying to save on your memory, your computer memory, if you come down under System, it will limit your undo steps to 32 steps. Now, I make mistakes a lot as I work, and sometimes I'm well beyond 32 steps before I realize I've made a mistake. So I'm just going to max that out at 256 and save those preferences. That's going to help us if we need to do a lot of undos later on. All right, enough talking. Let's actually try and render something now. Let's exit out of our preferences there, and let's bring back that cube. Now, if you deleted the cube, if you didn't have the option to Control Z and bring it back, let's actually look at how we add something to the scene. So we've looked at deleting, now let's try to add something. To add something, you've probably guessed by now, you can come up here to the Add menu at the top left of your 3D viewport. There is a shortcut for this, which is Shift A. This is definitely one you're going to want to learn. Some shortcuts are optional. This one, just learn it because you're going to be adding stuff to your scene all the time. So hit Shift A and that'll bring up that little pop-up there. And we get the option to add all of these different things to our scene. Let me just go over each of these and kind of tell you what they do. So this first one is mesh. Now, mesh is kind of like another word for geometry. These are basically just shapes you can add to the scene. So we could add a plane, delete that. We could add a cube. I'm just going to go through these. A circle, UV sphere, an isosphere or icosphere. I'm actually not sure how you say that, which is a sphere made out of triangles. The UV sphere was made out of what we call quads, which are faces with 4 points. The icosphere is made out of triangles. Okay, then we have a cylinder, we have a cone, and we have a torus. Then we have some bonus objects here. Oops, got ahead of myself. We have a grid, which is just a plane that is subdivided. It has more points on the inside. I'll show you how we get into that component mode where we're looking at the points in just a second. We call it edit mode. And then we have a monkey. Now, this monkey's name is actually Suzanne. You might have seen her around. It's kind of a Blender thing. This has been a primitive shape and kind of a test object in Blender since the beginning, since, as far as I'm aware, the first version. It's certainly been around since the 16 years I've been using it, but those are the mesh objects that you can add to a scene. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but when I added each of those, we got a little pop-up that showed after I added it. So for example, let me add a cylinder, and it's easy to miss, but we have this temporary little pop-up that showed at the bottom left of our screen. And if I click that and expand it, we can see some options here. Now, this is kind of like your one-time chance to change some settings in this mesh object before this option goes away forever. Now, the reason for that is these objects are called primitive shapes. These are not intended to stay as they are. So Typically, if I'm adding a cylinder into a scene, for example, maybe my ultimate plan is to change it into the shape of a jar. To do that, I'm going to be performing some different modeling functions, things like extruding and scaling to create the shape of this jar. This is just one example. When I add the cylinder, I have one chance to change kind of the foundation of this primitive shape, and that option is going to go away because Blender knows I'm going to be changing that. I'm going to be extruding it, changing the shape and stuff. Hopefully that makes sense. Long story short, we get this pop-up. You only have one chance. As soon as you make a change to this cylinder, let's say I scaled it, for example, which is something we can get into later, then the option to change the initial variables of that cylinder has gone away. We've lost it forever. Now you could try to hit F9 to bring something back, but all that's going to do is it's going to bring back the options for your last performed operation, your last operation. So since the last thing I did was scale this, when I press F9, it's just bringing up the options for how I scaled it. And I could go back and I can change those options. But the actual options for generating the mesh have gone away. So let's delete that cylinder and let's add another one so I can show you those options. So we have that little pop-up once again. If you just happen to click on accident and you haven't performed any other operations, then you can press F9 and that will bring up your last operation. So we have the number of vertices we can have in this cylinder. The more we add, kind of the smoother that face, the surface of the cylinder will be. Now, keep in mind, you don't want to go crazy with this. I mean, Blender can handle millions and millions of vertices or triangles, but you want to kind of only use as much as you need for a particular use case. And that's something you'll get a feel for as you start modeling and creating different things. But by default, it's 32. You could raise that, you could lower it. As a general rule of thumb, when we're talking about cylinders and circles, I like to keep things an even number, and that'll make sense as you start modeling and you run into scenarios where you need this to be even. But I'm not going to get too much into that just because I don't want to overcomplicate this. We have our radius. So by default, Blender is working in meters. So this by default is 1 meter, okay? Really cool thing in Blender is you could click on these fields and you can change things. So you could type in 2. I'm not going to press enter because that will make this whole window go away. I'm just going to left click and that will change that to 2. Now the cool thing about Blender is it does conversions for you. So let's say you're working with a client, or maybe your mind works in a different system. So maybe you're not in the metric system, but you're thinking in terms of like feet and yards and inches. So you could actually type in, for example, you could either spell it out or you could just abbreviate it. So like 1 FT for 1 foot, and it will convert that. So 1 foot is 0.305 meters. Or like I said, you could type in like 9 inches. You could spell it out, or you could just say 9 IN, and that will do the conversion and change that back to meters. So that's one of my favorite things about Blender, is it handles all those conversions for you, which is really cool. We have the depth, which is kind of like the height. And then we have, oops, lost that. Let's press F9 again. Cap fill type. So we could have nothing, which is just going to leave the top and the bottom caps empty. N-gon, which is something, that's a term we're going to get into, but basically that just means it's going to fill it with one solid face that has all of those points. Or we could have a triangle fan, which right now doesn't look like there's a difference. But what that one is basically all of the points at the top converge in one point at the center, which kind of makes this triangle looking fan. And we can change where it appears in the scene. Right now it's set to align to the world, which is again our entire 3D viewport, and it's appearing at 0 meters, which is the center. It's on X, Y, Z, it's just at 0. So everything's zeroed out. If we change the X, as you would expect, it would kind of crawl along that red line, the X-axis, but let's just change that back to 0. And then we have rotation as well. So rotation does not work in meters. Rotation works in radians. You can think about that as like degrees. So if this was rotated 90 degrees on the X-axis, for example, then it's laying on its side. So these are just the options we get when we're creating a new or adding a new mesh object into the scene. And again, you only get those options once. If you happen to click away, you can press F9 to take a look at them again. But if you perform another operation on top of this, then the option to edit this will kind of go away forever. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So let's go ahead and add our monkey, Suzanne, and we'll spit out our first rendered image. Now to take a picture of this, we're gonna need a camera. We had a camera in our scene by default. I'm going to delete everything but our monkey just because I want to show you how to add those and how to position them on your own. So now to add a camera, again hit Shift A, and we have not just mesh objects, but we have all sorts of objects here. If you come down towards the bottom, 4 from the bottom, you'll see camera. Now we've added that to the scene, and you might not see it right away because it appeared at the world origin, which is 0, 0, 0. It's inside our monkey's head. The rotation right now, we can zero that out as well. Now I just did a cool thing in Blender. If you want to change multiple values at once, what this is called, it's called a vector. A vector is just a collection of 3 numbers. It's something that happens really, really frequently in 3D. Things like X, Y, Z, or RGB for colors. But anyway, if I wanted to change all 3 of these at once, like I just did, you just click and drag, and then you can type in your value for all 3, and there you go, it changed all 3 at once. So that's something that's really useful. I just zeroed that out, so it's just pointing straight down, and let's rotate it 90 degrees on X, so it's just looking kind of in that direction. It's been rotated 90 degrees on this red X-axis. Okay, so we have our camera. Now let's talk about actually moving this camera around. So you have a few options. One of the options is you could use what's called a gizmo. So when you select your camera, on the left-hand side here, we have some different gizmos and just our general tools. Now, by the way, if you don't see this, if you're confused, like where is it? It's because you press the T button. T stands for toolbar. And if you press T, that goes away. You could bring it back by pressing T, or there's a little arrow here. It's just a tiny arrow. It's trying to stay out of the way. You can click that and that will bring back your toolbar. Now, in our toolbar, we have 3 different gizmo types. We have move, which is the location of our object. We have rotate, which of course is the rotation, and then we have scale, which is the size of things. Now, I don't personally use these gizmos, but this is very, very common for 3D software in general, and a lot of artists are going to be most comfortable with the use of gizmos, so I wanted to show you where they are. And the way this gizmo works is now we have these 3 arrows that we can use to position whatever it is we're positioning. All you have to do is click and drag, and now Blender has this functionality where if you're in the middle of something and you kind of change your mind, you want to cancel out of it, instead of letting go of my left click and then Control Z, what I can do at any point if I'm not happy with what I'm doing is I can right click, and that will just abandon whatever we're working on right now. I could also just press escape. Right click and escape kind of do the same thing in this context. So we have our gizmos. We can also rotate the camera with these. If you click on a specific axis, or if you hover over it, it'll kind of show you which one you're rotating on. Or if you click in between, you can rotate kind of freely. And that goes the same for location or moving. I can either hover over a specific axis, or I can go in between a few, and that will allow me to move on two different axes and eliminate one. So for example, if I grab this plane right here, I'm moving on Z and X, but I'm not moving forward and backward on that Y axis. Something similar with the scaling. I could just kind of grab anywhere and it'll scale up and down on all three dimensions at once, or I can choose one particular one. Now, with the camera, that's not a great example, but with the monkey, for example, I could scale just on one axis. So let's go back to the camera, and let me show you another way you can move and rotate and scale things around. Now, like I said, I don't typically use gizmos. I just keep this on box select. And this is the case for a lot of artists in Blender. This is where we kind of go into shortcut hell. If you're not familiar with shortcuts, it's not too bad, but for some people, this is a new concept. So I typically like to use G for grab, S for scale, and R for rotate. The cool thing about those three shortcuts, G, S, and R, is you can pair them with any axis. So for example, if I have my monkey here, I can press S to scale, and then I can press X to only scale on the X axis. I could even take it further and I can type in a specific value like 2. And what that's done is it's scaled S on X 2, a multiple of 2. So it's 2 times bigger on the X axis now. Again, that was S, X, 2, enter. It's a lot of keys, but once you get used to this concept of what we're doing here, oops, I don't want to save. I just wanted to undo. Then it becomes really quick. You could scale on Y. You could scale by a factor of 4. You could even do decimals. So we could hit S for scale, and we could do 0.5. Now it's half as big, or half the scale that it was before. We could do S and 50, and now it's 50 times bigger than it was before. So these shortcuts, again, it's G, S, and R. Now if I hit R once, it's kind of rotating from wherever my view is. I could also hit a specific axis, or I can hit R and then press R again, and it'll enter kind of this free rotation mode that was similar to if we grabbed just in the middle of the gizmo there. Now there's one other thing. We can also exclude a specific axis. So remember with the gizmos how you could grab like in between, for example, and you could scale on everything except for the Z axis. You could scale on X and Y. We could do something similar with shortcuts. All we have to do is hold down Shift and then press the axis. So for example, S for scale and then Shift Z will scale on everything except for the Z axis. Now, if you want to confirm whatever it is you're doing, you can left click or press enter. And if you want to cancel the current operation, you can right click or press escape. So I'll usually just right click and it'll jump right back. So with all of that said, review that section as needed. All the info's in there. But now we can start to move our camera. So let's do grab on Y, and let's bring it back. And that can kind of give us a good view on our monkey face. We could also jump into the camera view to try and position the camera. And to do that, we're going to look at our first pie menu. So pie menus are a really great way to quickly jump to different options. This particular pie menu is the tilde key. And again, it's less to do with the fact that it's the tilde key, which is right under the escape key, by the way, and more to do with the location of that key. It's kind of just in that left-hand column of the keyboard, and it's easy for my left hand to find even if I'm not looking down at my keyboard. So hold down the tilde key, and we get this pie menu where we get all these different options. And this is a quick way to jump to different views in our scene. Now, the idea of a pie menu is it's very fast. It's just supposed to take quick gestures, okay? So if you hold down this pie menu, you see a lot of different options. If we want to jump to the front view, for example, we can hover over that and let go. Or if you're just used to this gesture-based pie menu, then what you could do is just very quickly kind of gesture in the direction you want to go. So if I want to look at the right-hand side, I just barely press that pie menu and gesture towards the right. I could do the same with top view, front view, back view, whatever it is. Now in that menu, we also have view camera, which jumps into our camera view. And while we're in this view, now this is the cool thing about not using gizmos and using the shortcuts, is we could press G to grab and we could choose a particular axis. So I could press G and X to move on the X axis. I could press R and Z to rotate on the Z axis. There's just lots you could do with that. Some people are not comfortable with that kind of navigation for the camera. So I'm going to show you two other alternatives. Number one is what I call video game mode. It's actually called fly mode. And to enter into fly mode, what you do is you press Shift tilde. So again, it's just the left hand. Those are easy to reach. And Shift tilde enters into the WASD just video game mode where you can kind of fly around. You can also press E and Q and use your mouse, and that's just a really nice natural way for me to position my camera. If I'm happy with the positioning, I left click. If I want to jump out of this and not commit to this change, I can just right click or press escape, and that just goes back to where the camera was. But let's actually just fly around and try to find a flattering angle of Suzanne here. So let's just go right there. And we can also just rotate the camera by double tapping R. Now, anything you do in Blender, if the operation is too fast and a little too squirrely, you can always hold down Shift, which will fine tune your movement. So for example, if I double tap R and my camera's just rotating all over the place, I can hold down Shift, and that will allow me to half the speed of whatever it is I'm trying to do. And that is particularly useful right now where I want to rotate the camera just right. So I said I'd show you two ways to position your camera. That was just number one. So that was the Shift tilde fly mode positioning. Another way you could do it is we're going to open up a new tool menu. And this is called the N panel. N as in Nancy. So if you press N on your keyboard, you get a right hand menu. So remember, T was the left hand one. If you press N, you also get this right hand menu. And if you forget that, there's a little arrow here you can just click on and you get this menu. Now, this is where we get all sorts of different tabs that are going to be very, very heavily used in add-ons and things that you install to Blender. But for now, this is somewhere where you can view where an object is in 3D space. So for example, this camera that I have selected right now is 2.7798 meters on the y-axis. So if I change that, you can see how it moves around on y, or on x, sorry. We also have the y-axis, and of course we have z or z, depending on where you're from in the world. Then we have our rotation, and we have our scale. So this is another area where you can access kind of these different transform, rotation, scale of a selected object. We also have various tools. Now this is going to be depending on what you have selected in your scene. Right now, we're not going to look at that. What we want to look at is view. And the reason for that, let's jump back into our camera with the tilde pie menu, go down to view camera, is we have this option called view lock. And what we could do is lock our camera to our view. And once we've locked our camera to our view, if we are to navigate around the scene now, you could see that our camera follows wherever our navigation is. And it's going to follow whatever we're doing until we jump back out of the camera in that pie menu. So a lot of people like that. This is how Maya, for example, operates. This isn't something I'm particularly used to, and I'll tell you why I don't use this. But just know that this is there if this is more comfortable for you. Then you can kind of jump into your camera, position it where you want it to be, and then jump out and continue working in your scene. Now the reason I keep this off is because as I'm working and setting up my scene, what I like to do is I like to zoom in, for example, into my image to have like a closer look at a texture or something. Then I can zoom back out and I haven't accidentally moved my camera. So that's just personal preference, but just know that you can view or lock your camera to your view if that's what you prefer. So now we've positioned our camera and we're almost ready to render our first image. I'm not going to keep that information secret from you. To render an image, all you have to do is press F12 on your keyboard, and that's going to render our first image. But as it stands right now, we don't have any lights in our scene, so we can't even really tell what's going on. We kind of just see the silhouette of Suzanne, but we don't have any lights. So for our first rendered image here, we're going to add a light to the scene. And if you don't remember, that's just Shift-A for add to get the add menu. And if you go to the light tab here, we have a few different types of lights. A point light is going to be just that. It's going to be a single point in space that emits light from all different directions. A sunlight mimics the sun. It's infinitely far away, but it is uniformly strong. So it doesn't matter how far away it is, it's always the same strength kind of on everything in the scene all at once. Then we have a spotlight, which is kind of a more focused beam of light that doesn't extend beyond the bounds that you set for it. So it's just like a spotlight on like a stage. And then we have an area light, which you can think of as kind of just like a plane or a disc that emits light from a larger surface. So that's what we're going to add is an area light, and that just added to the middle of the scene. So there's a lot of different ways we can move this up. We can go to our gizmo over here. You can press G and then Z, or you can come up to your item and you can move it up on the Z axis, which, oh, that was scale, my bad. Let's go to location, that's better. And then yeah, let's actually increase the scale there on all three X, Y, and Z at once. So we have this soft light that's directly above our monkey. We can render that again, or we can go into a rendered preview in our viewport. And to do that, let's look at our second pie menu. So for this one, just hold down Z, and we have a few different views. Let's just take a little tour here. We have our solid view, which is what we're on right now. We have our wireframe, which is going to get rid of the shading, and it's just going to show us kind of the cage, the wireframe of everything. Then we have material preview, which is going to be useful when we get into texturing. And finally, we have rendered view, which is going to show us a preview of what things look like rendered. Now we have Suzanne, we have a light up here. Let's just look at a few basic properties before we finish this video and get ready for the next in this series. Now, what I want to say right now is obviously, let's see, we're into this over an hour now. There's a lot we need to cover in Blender. This isn't something we're going to cover in one sitting. I'm going to give you about an hour's worth of content at a time and then give you some time to digest it. In order to do that, I'm going to be teaching you in a series over on my Patreon. So you can find my Patreon, patreon.com/RileyB3D. And the reason I do it that way is obviously this takes a lot of time for me. And so I do, just the reality of it, I have to make back some money with the time that I spend doing this. Now, I try to give as much free content as I can here on the YouTube, but your support just for a few dollars a month really helps me out if I get enough people on board and I can continue this series and others. So I'd love to get into, this video's kind of just been getting to a point where you have your first image, helping you know about navigating in Blender and some very basic functions and some preferences that I like. But I'd love to get into more in-depth lighting and texturing and animation and rendering and just all the stuff that goes into 3D production. So yeah, that's where you can find future courses as they come out. But let's go ahead and look at a few properties of our light and of our scene here, of our world. So on the right-hand side, we've kind of just kept into the outliner and the 3D viewport, but there's another panel here called our properties, and this is where you're going to find exactly that, just properties for all sorts of things in Blender. Now, this is also context sensitive. So what I mean by that is, depending on what you have selected in your 3D viewport, is what options are going to show up in your properties. So let's go ahead and select our light, and then we have a little light bulb icon here, which is our data. So if we click that, we have some options for the power and the color of this particular light source. So the power is done in watts, and this is actually a physically accurate measurement. So we could change this from 10 watts to something like 50 watts, and that's going to light up Suzanne much better. We could also change the shape of our particular area light. So if we wanted this to be more of a disc, then we could do that. It didn't make a huge difference in this particular setup that we have here. We can also change the size as well as the color. So let's just set up a really, really basic light setup here, basic as you can get it. We have a bluish light. I'm going to scale back how blue that is above Suzanne here. And you'll notice we're kind of getting this gray environment light that's kind of filling things in this gray color, right? So if we come over here to our properties and we go to the world properties, that's where we can find the color of this kind of omnipresent gray that's just coming in from all different angles, as well as the strength of our world lighting. So I'm just going to change this to something like blue to show you what I mean. Now you see there's an omnipresent blue light that's everywhere. We can also change it to black, which is the same as just turning this off. So now we only have one very focused light source overhead. And let's go ahead and go back, hold down Z for our pie menu. Let's go back to solid mode and let's press F12 again to render. And we have our beautiful image here of a monkey head. If you don't want to press F12, you can also come over here to render and you can render an image and it'll tell you F12 is the shortcut there. So that's as far as we're going to go for this video. I've shown you as much as I can show you in an hour, but obviously there's much, much more we can get into and that I want to show you in Blender. Been using this tool for over half my life now, for 16 years, and there's just a lot to get into. I've used it in a professional capacity. Currently, I use it as an asset and environment artist for different various game projects, which I get to be involved with. And you can use Blender for not just the entertainment industry, for games and for VFX, but there's just so much you can get into, so many different industries. It's not even worth listing them off because there's so much you could do with it. But yeah, like I said, go check out my Patreon. I'll continue this course kind of as I see interest in it. I'll continue it regardless, but depending on how much interest there is how fast I get into subsequent chapters. But I want to get into more with you. Thanks for checking this out, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.